This way, I didn't see everybody.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Cara Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple. And I am delighted to welcome tonight Barbara Tomash and Elizabeth Robinson for the release of their collections, Her Scant State and Thirst and Surfeit. Is that correct? Is that my pronunciation? Yeah. Perfect. Elizabeth actually has two recent collections, so we'll talk about those momentarily. Thank you all for joining us both in person and online. Hello, online audience. We appreciate you. We are broadcasting from San Francisco, California. We are on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, and we hope that you join us in our pledge to turn land acknowledgement into action by donating either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization every time you hear a land acknowledgement. I have very brief business before we get to the heart of the hour. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. I would say picture taking is encouraged, but you can run that by our poets. Please do check out our full event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you are currently attending. The restroom is behind us. It is available after the event, not during the event for obvious reasons. And if you have any questions about how to get to it or how to use it, I'm happy to answer. We have books from both of our poets available at the front register. You can find them there, and I think they would be happy to sign them for you afterward if you ask politely. And if you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you also support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so kindly. So tonight we are going to hear from each of our poets. They're going to have a bit of a conversation after that. And I think we'll be taking questions.
Yeah, sure.
And they'll be taking questions afterward as well. So I'm delighted to introduce our first reader. Elizabeth Robinson is the author, most recently, of both Excursive and Thirst and Surfeit. Rendered Paradise, written collaboratively with Susan Dickman, will soon be out from Apogee Press. Robinson has recently been the writer of a pushcart and Editor's Choice Prizes from Scoundrel Time and New Letters, a recipient of grants from the Fund for Poetry and the Foundation for Contemporary Arts. Robinson has also been a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award. She lives in Pinole, California. Let's give another hand for Elizabeth Robinson.
Oh, oxygen.
What time is it? Thank you very much, Car, and thank you, Barbara, for including me in this celebration of your book. And I'm going to read a few things from Excursive, which is some new poems, some quite not new poems. And for quite a long time, I was just I was using this as a way to write into kind of blank spaces in my life whenever I perceive something, and I would just write to it. So, on the vote. This is the artwork of effort, poll tax, a festoon of chads hung from the mantle of justice, yet still a dearth of ballots. The longest line drawn across precinct and day and through our names. We are all felons. Denial makes us thirsty. No one may bring us water as we wait. A performance whose rhythm is obstruction, a gallery of empty voting stalls. The dead, they claim. Vote and vote and vote. We hear their chorus. We tally our attempts as a lost art. Set this down. I'm going to read two sort of geologic poems. So this one is called On Krakatoa. Time was a tumor in its very own landmass. It couldn't have been more intrepid. Think of the tumor speaking in first person. I climbed my own eruption. and higher. I said, "Excuse me," when I vomited. Time was a contagion that forced currents against their own grain. I protected my central organ from the core of my body, that is, violently, that is, intrepid, not the lung or heart, but the stomach. Time was a countermeasure to civility. Excuse me, infectious. Time says, I am the cancer who ruptures the atmosphere with fumes of extraordinary beauty, who climbs the sky with an affronting blush while the sun declines. So it speaks to our atmosphere today. And then another one especially for Californians. On walking in the San Andreas Fault. Walking is the only consolation where the very soil is contaminated with instability, where the soothing maternal voice of reason doesn't say, there, but where? The sky above threatens perennially to fold and drop, temblor, seismism, tremor. Best to take shelter in the fault. Better to walk on friction itself, heels in the where, treading on that soothing voice, because it is a fount, a full breast so ready to release the foremilk of solace. Walking is a consolation that hardly worries the nursling gap in the world which suffers from its own mild infinite, where reliance and need, where maternal fault. One hesitates to use the word cradle. Heels pummel the udder, rut, croon of rift. So I'm pleased to read from Thurston Surfeit, and these are not new poems. Some of them were written before I moved away from San Francisco the last time I lived here. But some of them are relatively new, and maybe that's pertinent because they're all about history. So the first couple I'm going to read are from the Bog People. Toland Man. A name finds itself in a bog, filtered, and then it bears ridicule in relation to the ridiculous. What is it upon which you rest but a skin made literally into leather? Weight has a purifying character, pelt turned metal. Once your face was a fingerprint, not made for purposes of identification, but assertion. Time's serenity borrows its voice from sphagnum, old photos, rubberized bones, a reticule of fuel. The Windbee Girl. Death is not death, but a blindfold, rock in the crook of your arm. Even in war, when cotton bandages were in short supply, they made substitutions just as you did. The woolen headband shifts from your bare head and covers your eyes. Stanched with water, the despite of flows. Girl, girl, they called you from time immemorial, when you might have swallowed your sexual organs. This burnished skin peeled back from your ribcage to reveal your hips. What grows shallow derives from itself. Meanie Braden woman. Your conscience has a face blurred and fibrous. There a hand unfurls from below expression to brush the hair back from the brow. Here stood a good wife, and here stood her cottage, and here came the angry cauldron to smear her with preservative, a spoon surrounded with itself. And here I came from out of your cape by a 500 years margin. It is as you wish, by right to be disinterred, and by virtue to be cast back, tendered to the true face and disclosed. So I'm going to jump ahead a couple centuries and did a series of poems on Anne Hutchinson, who is one of my beloved historical figures, and she was she was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and exiled to Rhode Island, where she was ultimately killed by some Native American, but she was involved in a very intense theological controversy, and she was on the side of grace. It didn't go over well with some of the country's fathers. She was also a midwife. If my interlocutor were faith, midwiving, can we have faith in the master who knows that the baby exists but cannot coax it from the womb? A cup cannot be enough evidence of its content. There is another eye given to see the overflow, and a hand that cradles the head as it is born from the gut of its mother, the hand gladly stained with its birthing blood. I have seen over and over one body given by another, enough to know what faith is, like the water that cannot hold shape without the curve of the cup, transparent, issuing forth from its exhausted mother, too innocent, the formless baby. I'm going to read some. I changed my mind since driving over the bridge. I wrote a series of poems about something called the Canudos Rebellion, which was in Brazil, and it was a kind of peasant rebellion following a charismatic, I think, defrocked Catholic priest. And the people were living like very, very close to the bone in incredibly harsh circumstances. But when the government sent troops to try to overcome them that were armed, they repelled them several times. Yeah. So they were remarkable. So I'm also influenced by a book by Mario Vargas Llosa called The War of the End of the World. That is a fictionalized account of this, but it was something that genuinely happened. The Broken Man. What is real deforms its witnesses. Thus you, the phenomenon following the phenomenon. This procession. You tear a ray from the intolerant sun and brandish, you with your shattered arms and foreshortened legs. Convection follows on serration. What reality does not include? This noble deformity called fact, as it leads, will famish the dirt tract. Memory. This also has to do with having been in Brazil and seeing the vast disparities between poverty and wealth. Being the wealthy ones, eating coconut cake, having coins stolen, having the world behave as a white and porous skirt that locks the room in shade. Yes, set apart and watching the shit fall to the mosaic walkway, watching the leash to the shit remain tranquil in pattern. And in Brazil, when I was there, they were talking about this phenomenon, children being called little airplanes, and they would be messengers for like drug dealers. And then when they had outlived their usefulness, they would be exterminated. So this is called riddle. And what will you do when your papa finds you here? I will smell the magic exhaust that I emit when he beats me. And what will you do when your mama finds you here? I will bring back a pure thing for her. What will you do when the shopkeeper wishes to weigh you on his scale? I will give him his teeth, his plate, and the condiments. What will you do in the dark? I will sing the overheard song, the one who swerves tightly toward my own throat. And then, I'm just going to read something else that was grim and apocalyptic and environmental, but I'm not.
We can handle it though. I mean,
We're strong.
Well, I've been writing, as Barbara knows, I've been writing these rhapsodies, and so they're strange little rhapsodies. So this is the newest one. It's called Beheaded Rhapsody, or Cephalophore, and it speaks to when saints are beheaded and then they walk around carrying their head, not their horse, in their arms. It's a phenomenon. I heard a whole podcast about it. So, Beheaded Rhapsody. I knew I'd found you when you were riven from my neck and placed in my hands. Sphere, infant oracle, uninhabited, word, wherein you speak myself as I stroll to the burying place. And is it between my hands or the crook of my elbow that your cranial arteries empty as my bereft throat flares and fountains liquid stitches of blood meant to seal or sow a new unity that any saint must reject, ardent faith being by necessity dismembered, for the foundering union of self with self is slung in a hammock between forearm and bicep, and so my lips turn to me to suckle as much as to sever, a red collar marking us as mortal cut off from enduring. Thus I and myself float, and always away, away, the froth and filth life would put awash on I and this you, always a hot halo who quivers for haven, whether at head or at open throat, at odds with, hovering over the howling born thing that topples from its perch into my raw palms, and now to shush your tender lips as they suck in a new vocation, tongue swallowing hard against the unholy air as it erupts.
whoa.
Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Let's give one more hand for Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Spirited. Thank you so much. Our next reader, I'm actually very excited to introduce our next reader, not only because she's my beloved instructor at San Francisco State, but Barbara also introduced me to Elizabeth's work. And now I met Elizabeth in person, which is very nice, and I'm so glad to have you all under one roof here. Barbara Tomash is the author of 4 previous full-length books of poetry, including most recently Pre and 2 chapbooks of Residue and A Woman Reflected. Her writing has been a finalist for the Dorset Prize, Colorado Prize, the Test Site Poetry Prize, the Black Box Poetry Prize as well. She lives in Berkeley, California, and her most recent book for Scant State is part of the reason we are here this evening. Please welcome Barbara Tomash.
Thank you so much, Par, for that introduction. And, woo, Elizabeth, incredible reading. So I'm still getting myself back together after that. Really, really beautiful. So I'm happy to be here tonight to read from my new book. And I'm particularly happy to read with Elizabeth because when I was just starting to get glimmers of writing this and was writing the very first parts of her Scant State and didn't know what it was, I went to visit Elizabeth in Boulder, Colorado. The weekend she got engaged to Randy.
Oh.
And we were reading poetry together. I mean, why not? And so I began reading some of these first writings, and they were interested. And to have other poets interested is what keeps you going. And so then I went forth into the wilderness of her Scant State. And when I got it kind of pretty together, Elizabeth then really was instrumental in the final form that this book took. So it means a lot to me to read with her tonight. So I'm going to start, though, with a little starter of, and keeping kind of with some of the themes that Elizabeth was reading. I'm going to read from a Conjunctions issue called Fear Itself. And the editor put my work together as 12 nightmares. So watch out. But I'm only going to read 2 of these nightmares. And this is from a new manuscript. And I don't know if you can see it, but they're all in these long, narrow columns and without any punctuation. So every time I read them, they come out a little differently. And so I'll read 2 of these just as a taste. A flight. Have you ever seen a possum drop from a tree, dead weight, spirit chased out? Have you ever heard a bone snap inside you and waited as one waits for music to start? Many animals freeze or play dead when touched. If you or your child cannot scream, vocal cords paralyzed. Stay perfectly still. Change color swiftly. There will be a period of heightened awareness, more attention paid the eyes, increased coagulation to prevent excessive blood loss. Have you ever removed pieces of gravel from your skull? Here, where gravity flung you and abandoned you like a log. My nights are not populated by female horses, though I wish they were. I desire increased heart rate, violent muscular activity, leaping over submerged cars in flooded cities, galloping unsinged in trailer parks on fire. I am isolated from the herd. I cannot overcome the wolves' fearful howling. Of exposure. Let me be clear. I took my shirt off. I stood naked by the sea. The forest burned. I can't hear it burning. Let me be clear. The grass grew, poured forth, stumbled on a rock. Let me be clear. I live in honeyed light at the source of nearly potable water. The dining hall doors flung open. What a dog knows, I want to know. Something has stopped. I took off my shirt. I stood by the exposed asphalt hospital, my igneous arms held out in the shape of a pine. The earth did not rotate. I did not feel it rotating. Remnants of dry leaves, brown swales, some birds circled like smoke. Some with camouflaged plumes ran crazily in scrub. Let me be clear, those attracting red berries could be poison. The billowing stopped. And looking at the audience, I have to say, Sarah Hetty's sitting here, and I wanted to thank Dropley for publishing some of these poems in chapbook called Of Residue. Thank you. So now I'll read from her Scant State, this cover. And her Scant State is an erasure of the Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. And you may ask why Why? Why?
Why?
And so I'll try to answer that. When I was a young woman, I read for the first time The Portrait of a Lady, and it had a huge impact on me. I felt like Henry James kind of intuited or had his finger on the pulse of what happened in America as capitalism was burgeoning and growing more and more powerful. And he was able to somehow get onto the page the way that capitalism dug into our most intimate and most personal lives so that every relationship became transactional. But the part that really got to me was the portrayal of Isabel Archer, who was really the first time I read an adult novel, not a novel for girls, where the male author seemed to really like the woman character. And that meant a lot to me because going forth into young womanhood, I had this feeling that everybody who wrote a book had an icky feeling about women. I know that's weird, but that's how I felt. And it was really hard. It was really hard because I loved books. I loved novels the most. So this novel meant a lot to me. There's other things I could say about it. But anyhow, I'll read from Her Scant State. Her Scant State. As far as the limits of the room allow, I have asked permission, with a piano and with flowers, with phrases and gradations in speech, for a lapse in continuity. Like a novel, his two hands on her shoulders were received, and husband slowly resumed, reading silvery observation. Her hands folded upon, of course, I'm lovely. It was knife-like, the disorder, erect into law, a house. The right word, as flicker of a match, as so many things at once going home, covered with a drooping veil. I think without intending it, fretting the edge of my ignorance, my blunders. I told you it was exactly to do with bad, stupid art. Possibly, but yours. Now it pains the breeze rose out of life. If she touched it, it struck her. Character. It struck her as a word stupidly pale, emphatically easy. An inquisitive, experimental quality. Which of the daughters are you? Writing money, anything about money, in point of fact, inherited. A wedge of brownstone, violently. With folded hands, I can only give, as I say, a blank page, a pure white surface, easily, easily crushed. Please tell me I have no memory. There was a young girl. I miss, I like, I'm really, I don't. When the sun goes, I go, I wish. Just a small sound, like hands quickly kissed. I'm afraid I'm only the small dark, the clear gray, which gave as it opened. She danced very well. The choreographic circle constituted the limits of her own power, to frisk and jump and shriek. Cloudy envelope of epic, to gender memory, wars, bouquets. I speak in secret discriminations, anticlimax, not smart, neat prose. impossible world to walk, thick, brown, weak, and red and human, without touching the ground. Brilliant correspondent feels effacing history from view. In clouds, out of breath, physical weight flung, atmospheric. A voice beat faster. Wrong, wrong, said without quaver. The privileges of abundant new dresses, kaleidoscopic. The name of a straight young man, a foolish period of history, standing near the lamp, requesting your attention. I've seen poverty's handshake burst the fact angry window open, and wildest hurt set up a house. A pretty American gaze doesn't abuse people. You know that perfectly. Still ironic, like a brown velvet jacket, like a joke dying hard for a delicate glow of shame. Many forms, shocked and false and lost, drifted about the house, or sat in the garden, head thrown back, irreclaimable. Indebted suburban hours, and all young lovers listen to the nightingales. Dear limitation, the illumination was dying. I waked, but was asleep, very much so, and I never arrive at the point, a certain point, a word I see caught and put into a cage, and letters in absurd pockets. Words should make mistakes and want no breakfast and live on air, quietly, coldly. I do. I go back. I take. Terrible mouthful. The privilege isn't seen by bedroom candle. These still bright days, the passion for minor needs was the tragic part. I'm sorry, money. My business is not to make myself. In abundance, the abundance craved a beautiful sister. I imitate need. I don't see how we use that word. All sorts of ordinary things, paper, lampshades, roses, fire, bibs, family, had designs on you, writing you. You in the strongest terms. You if you can stand it. A specimen of what? A woman reflected, constantly turned over, looked into, incurred, for assuming to be eager, that eager might receive her. She had shown she was a person, exaggerated, a whole museum, a high house, immersed in violence, historic, visited by tourists. She gushed out local color. Enough. Limoges enamels, the proportions of windows, the details haunted, then warmed her. Impunity, heterogeneous, nationality, disavowed, houses resembling, innermost ornaments, shifting, breakup, death, domicile. I had to trouble you with her thoughts. A theory about me. I won't be thought. I protest. My own nation for a lifetime. Poor human heart to represent things, to exhaust all remedies. The lightest part of a person dropped from the rain, who was never herself, disappeared. They had crossed the threshold to the bright, empty room. With words, penetrate, pretending, lash, it vibrated. She went to study the pause she had opened. At the door of a house of floating fragments, her hands folded on the edge of the table, as the lid of a box opened into immeasurable space, midnight came back, but not the hours she had come for. In a voice that was not fear, I think I can say something. Consolation, allow me elation. I won't return to the subject again. In her own swimming head, each aggressive fact wrecked and underwater. A train of images sinks, darts the darkness nothing reached. Only she pauses, perfect in suspense. Thank you. Thank you, Carter.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. Let's give one more hand for Barbara Tomash.
That's great.
So don't go too far, because I'd like to welcome both Barbara and Elizabeth to just talk a little bit about their work among us, among their admirers.
Among the other writers, everybody
Yeah.
almost.
So we should just have a conversation.
Maybe you guys will help us, you out there.
How about fashion? Start there.
Fashions, yeah.
Barbara's better on that than I am.
I don't know, those are shoes. Okay, we could get distracted easily. So, well.
Well, so I was thinking earlier, and I said this to Barbara, that each of her books is really different. And so I was thinking it'd be interesting to ask you about that, and also for maybe us, for all of us, to talk about the virtues or liabilities of consistency, because I personally don't think consistency is the greatest literary virtue. So
Good thing you don't. Or you wouldn't like to read me. Yeah, so what can I say about that? I think that every book I write has, surprises me. I don't plan them out. I seem to find my way in because something hooks me, but it's true that formally, different things hook me. But I think there are threads connected and some methodology connected between them, and some themes that recur, like I'm, consistently interested in women. And I guess I'm consistently, formally experimenting, trying things out. And so, and also very interested in collage as a method. And I'll probably always be, like, I love to see how things come together in relation to each other that are not necessarily clearly related. But I think Pre is the book that was maybe the most extreme, in the sense that I was trying to see, I didn't know I was doing this, but once I had written the book, I saw that I was trying to see how far I could go in writing that wasn't telling. And how could language still be connected and have a purpose and have a meaning and elicit emotion without telling anything? Which is similar to without narrating, I guess.
It's interesting because I think it expresses, it's very expressive poetry. So, but then do you think if that was one end of the continuum, that her Scant State was in some sense or kind of subversive return to telling because you're working off a narrative structure? Yeah, oh, that's interesting. But I was thinking while you were reading tonight, then I've heard you read from it many times, and that it can be a different poem every time because it's relatively easy to excerpt and like reconstellate. So it's very supple, even though it holds a little bit of that narrative substrata.
Yeah.
So how to jump from that to a residue, those poems?
I don't know. I mean, jump is the word. I mean, those poems have, they continue Pre's method of collage, in that I'm not trying to use syntax to carry through a line of thought so much as using juxtaposition to create something like to create thinking, but not necessarily relying on syntax or something.
Do you feel more of a speaking subject in those poems than in Pre?
And that kept evolving more as I worked. I was first not really letting too much of that speaking subject in, and then she kept creeping in.
I like it.
Yeah.
I think it adds a sort of warmth to it.
Yeah.
I like it a lot.
So I could ask you the same question because your books are quite different too. And I think they have a lot of connecting threads. I mean, voice is always a hard thing to talk about, but I think even when you formally diverge a lot book to book, the voice is very recognizable. And I get concerned that, I guess I have no voice because, I'm always doing something so different. But I don't know about voice, and I don't know.
That's something we should talk about.
Someday.
I mean, maybe not here, but
Yeah.
that's interesting because I, for the 6 years before I came here, I was working with chronically unhoused people, and I didn't feel that I had time to write. So I was just taking notes, and then eventually I typed it up, and it is a manuscript, and somebody who looked at it said, I don't recognize the writer of this from your other work. And it felt like I have a long, ambivalent, but mostly unhappy feeling about narrative and its constraints. But when I was working with people whose narrative had been stolen from them, it felt important to return to some sense of narrative. So I think there are sometimes life experiences that cause you to make different decisions, or life experiences like reading a Henry James novel and having it make an impression that re-impresses you in a different way from the vantage of years. Like I like the way you bring out kind of this kind of feminism and capitalism, like capitalist critique. So for myself, I think the underlying, like Flannery O'Connor, I read an essay a long time ago where she said, you're writing something and it's of this world, but there's always a parallel world that accompanies it. And I think that's kind of the gist of my process, is trying to poke into that parallel world. And that could be like the way poetry gives you, like I did this book of pretending I was Pessoa, pretending he was other people.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, you could penetrate someone else's persona, or like just moving through history and saying, I will have intimacy with this bog woman who died many.
Yeah.
So I think language offers so much freedom. And the constraints are also a pleasure.
Yeah.
Which obviously
Yeah.
you really get involved with the constraints and what they can make.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in your, one of the great pleasures of your work, for me as a reader, is the way that you follow language into the poem, so that the language keeps turning on itself, so that a word, like a remarkable word, or it could be an ordinary word like ridicule, but before you know it, it's become reticule.
Ridiculous and ridicule.
And ridiculous. And I've always wanted to know how to pronounce that word. Reticule.
I say reticule.
So, yeah, and it's a 19th century novel word. Women always have their ridicule with them. And then, in that book, there's so much about the cavity and the opening in space. And then there's this reticule. And so often the language is, as the stanzas move, or as the poem moves, the language keeps looking at synonyms. So I feel that writers' love of language, like accompanying the journey into the poem, which can still be extremely essayistic, but it still's got this principle of following sound, and so in a way that feels like it's kind of this metaphysical thing within the poem, but also your poetry is often, for me, talking about metaphysical subjects. So I often think of John Donne when I read your work, because he kept that sound thing going, and rhyme, and following a word and making it mean something different, and using it in a surprising part of speech. But the whole time he's talking about the spirit and the body, and how do you negotiate between the two, which I think your work does also. So I wondered if you felt, if you had that sense of yourself as being a metaphysician poet.
So I'm the pastor of a church, which is a dangerous thing to tell poets. But I think, when I was really a little kid, I read about the Word made flesh. And so my entire life, that's like a touchstone. Like, it's erotic, it's enfleshed, it's incarnate, it's embodied, it's a word, it's ephemeral, it's ungraspable, and they are linked, and they are coursing through each other. And so that's metaphysical, but it's also
John Donne.
And Gerard Manley Hopkins, I think you can just get on the current and ride with him, and he takes you places, and it's through the sensuousness of language. Yeah. But also Emily Dickinson, who she has such a super distinct prosody, but she can, most lines have no more than 4 words, and they're usually 7 or 8 lines long, so they're incredibly tight. But she can open any kind of universe in that space. So, and my mother gave me an Emily Dickinson book when I was really young, and I just, yeah, so be careful what you give children.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying to think what I was given. So,
Yeah, but you're reading, you know, like it was your first non-girl novel.
Yeah.
Read Henry James. You get an amazing leap. What when you were going from like Anne of Green Gables to Henry James?
well, there was that happening, and of course it was all these men, you know, it's D.H. Lawrence and who, you know, a Faulkner who just made me feel just like shit as a woman, you know, just terrible. And it really stunned me because for me, books was my refuge. Books was where I went to feel whole. Books was where it was a sanctuary. It was another kind of parent that I felt safe with. And then it wasn't safe anymore. And it was pretty scary.
But you started off as a fiction writer, so there was some very considerable tug there.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about that and how that morphed into poetry.
I couldn't write fiction very well.
Probably not true.
Nobody can attest. She's here. I had, in the meanwhile, the other thing I loved so much was the visual arts. And in the meanwhile, I had done a lot of visual arts. And the way that I was learning to write fiction, you had to spend a lot of time getting people from here to there. There was a lot of narration, obviously. And it wasn't the part I was the most interested in. And when I took a poetry class, I just was enthralled that you could like cut a line wherever you wanted. And I must have been like maybe the first day of poetry class, I stayed up all night just writing and cutting lines and trying, well, how does it change if you make it 2 words per line? And what if it's 10 words per line? And what happens if you got it here? And I was just like, okay, now I'm happy. That just suited me a lot more, that kind of experimental quality and the formal questions and the way language changed and the way that you didn't have to tell everything. Was just much more suited to my artistic temperament.
So I'm trying to write a kind of memorial piece about Keith Waldrop, who made collages.
Right.
And he worked often in writing, kind of collaging.
Yeah.
It's not really that evident on the page, but I feel like maybe that's the more pertinent conduit is the visual, because you often use the page in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
And that ability to cut and reassemble and reconfigure seems really continuous with visual art.
Yeah. The process felt much more at home to me. And when I was making paintings, I would put words on them. Because it felt like something was missing without language. So, I think that poetry was a good bridge for me. And I also just think we do what we can do. If I could have written novels, maybe I would have. We have to work with our limitations. I think our art comes out of our limitations actually more than it comes out of our strengths.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to make art, you will make art. And I actually think if you acknowledge your limitations and work from them, it's probably going to be easier than if you keep trying to. I don't know.
I think of that in relation to like Larry Eigner, who, because of the mobility of his cerebral palsy, learned to use the page so perfectly. So that makes a lot of sense. Limitation can, and that's how language games, we choose the limitations.
But we have inner limitations too. I mean, and maybe there's no difference between our limitations and our strengths because that's just language, calling them one thing or another.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You guys are writers if you have. Yeah, Sarah?
Jump in.
Please.
Well, I guess, so as I'm thinking about both of your work, I'm thinking about the use of space on the page, which you started bringing up, Elizabeth, and Barbara, I'm curious how you arrived. I mean, there's a shapeliness to your work, and I think that it seems like part of the constraint element that you, perhaps I'm inferring, you establish a shape. I'd be interested in hearing more about how you arrive at the shapes. I mean, I could say that, for example, in her Scant State, in many of the poems, the element of the process, even if it's more shapely, there's a hint of the process, right? That it's like jagged little pieces that you found in a page or whatever section, and then the very footnotey almost quality of this part.
Right.
And each of your books that I've seen has that. So I'm curious about how you arrive at that for each project. And with Elizabeth, I think Thirst and Surfeit, I don't have all your books with me, but it's familiar to me to see you very comfortable in a real range of forms, from very prose to sort of in between to very lineated. And I'm similarly just sort of interested in how you know what the form is, you know, what comes first in your process, or how you feel your way into the form of a poem. So I guess just bouncing off the form question and the page for both of you.
Oh, well, I'll start by saying form really helps me write. I mean, I kind of need all the help I can get. And I think, writing's hard. And when I have a form to write into, it really assists me. It really helps me go forward. It helps me think. It's a place to think. It's a shape within to think. I mean, I think for me, I'm going to say think a million times. I think for me, thinking is writing. Writing down the page has to do with thinking down the page. And if I have, once I find a container or a form, it just assists. It's like a companion that's really supporting that whole endeavor. And so I guess I look for it pretty early on because it's gonna help me. And I know, like when I was first writing poems, I arbitrarily would set a margin just to make it arbitrary so that I had something to help me write towards, just anything. So maybe that open field that fiction writers deal with is just overwhelming to me. I don't know. But yeah, forms really help me, and I think in forms. So.
And it seems like it does have a real relation to your visual art practice in that way.
Yeah.
What about you, Elizabeth?
It's harder for me to say. I don't work with form the way Barbara does. I mean, I might adopt something but it's probably a little more conceptual. Like I did a whole manuscript of taking poems by Edwin Arlington Robinson, who has the same initials that I do, and just taking his end rhymes and then shunting everything else and then jamming my poems in. Like the Pessoa, like working with the idea of using quotes from Pessoa. So I've been really, really interested in persona. And also the idea of playing with narrative, but
resisting narrative. So it might affect the page. I think with the rhapsodies, which has really been fun, is there is a part of me that really loves the texture and flow of language, and to just not worry about that, because I feel like those of us who kind of came through in the 90s and early 2000s where the language poetry was like, no lyricism, that's so evil and privileged and blah. And now I'm like, lushness. But to try to like shock a little bit within the lushness, and to be like really embodied. So I think and also I don't have very much time at all. So I tend surprisingly somehow to write, but I tend to write fast. And then like think about it for a couple of days. Like I want to write about beheaded saints. I want to write about manna. I want to write about whatever, and then just like sit down and write it. So I think my poems are a lot messier than Barbara's, but that there's hopefully a space in the world for messy poems too.
I don't know. I think your mind is so clear that the poems never feel messy to me. And maybe all the language, like all the sound connections too, they feel very woven sonically. And so they never feel messy. Sorry.
Sarah, were you going to ask something?
Oh, yeah. God, no, I have other things. But, Barbara, I was going to ask you about, Portrait of a Lady is kind of a hefty book. So how did you deal with that? That kind of gives me a panic attack thinking about what I would do with that as the source material. Like, I would just lose my mind. It would just be so much to deal with, but maybe you were just very light with it, or maybe you like hoarded a million things and then winnowed them down. How did you do that?
I do remember saying to myself, I'm going to erase a novel. And I got, like my favorite novels off the shelf, and I looked at them. I picked ones that had been really important to me, and I started playing with them, and like clicked right away with Portrait of a Lady. And I didn't say, how am I going to get through this? Because I never think I'm going to accomplish necessarily anything. So I just started. But I do remember saying, okay, I wrote the first, I remember that I liked the second half of the book better. And I happened to have a really old edition that had volume 1 and volume 2. So I started with volume 2. And then I wrote the stuff that's at the bottom, that's more prose-like. I wrote volume 2. And then I said, oh, this was really fun. So I went back and I did volume 1. And then by chance operation, I just put them together. How they landed. And which is not to say that I didn't do a lot of cutting and editing, but yeah. And so overwhelmed. I think I was grateful to have all that language. I think I was just really grateful. Like there was all this language, like pages and pages and pages of language. And I was just so grateful. It's like, I don't have to sit here with a blank page and come up with language. Here's all this language, and now I can play with what's already here. Because it's stuff. And I think in that way, the visual arts is really in me. It's like that was the material. That was like that when I used to schlep home, material for assemblage, lumber and things I found on the streets, and, and I'd bring it home and I'd play with it and wire and this and that. So this was like, that was the material, that was the stuff that I had to work with. And once I have stuff, then it's great. So. Any other thoughts out there? Questions?
Both of you have series of poems. I wonder Oh, sorry.
We like the prepositions.
On,
Of.
of.
On poems. Can you say, if it wasn't on, what would it be?
Or of.
Yeah,
Or of.
yeah, answer that on.
You answer first. I don't know.
Okay, I'm gonna answer for Elizabeth. So on, for me, it's like it's a little essay.
Yeah.
You know, on, you know, and expound on. How did I start with of? I have no idea. And of is not as suggestive as essay to me. It's more,
Like, I feel like on is, I'm going to make a little package.
Mm.
And I feel like of is like, I'm going to unfold. And I do think that's what yours do. They're much more, like, I feel like they open out. And where I was playing with this faux containment. So.
yeah. Sometimes I read those just as essays. I look at them as essays. And I love that. But, I love essays. But, yeah, and I'm so interested in what you would have to say about persona, because I think persona is a really interesting and troubled area, because it's so easy to fall into some kind of mimicking or impersonating or
Exploitation.
okay, and but when you do it, there's none of that there. It's because I feel it still stays grounded in a real respectful acknowledgement that the writer is making this leap. You know, it's like it's acknowledged. I'm not trying to imitate a voice here. You know, you're not trying to talk like a woman in the 16th century. You're not imitating that voice or you're imagining something deeper about her voice. And,
Well, I really, really love Rimbaud's I is an other. And so that even when you're writing, you're not really writing yourself, or you're writing some other iteration or manifestation. I love that. Maybe that's metaphysical too.
yeah.
But I also feel like, because I have a whole manuscript of, it's called Being Modernist Together. It's all modernist, and a lot of times it's in first person or first person plural.
Yeah.
That it's a way to have intimacy with people who are no longer alive.
Yeah.
So you get to like know them and be with them and inhabit their lives, and you know, and that's the way it felt with the poems in Thurston's Surfeit often.
Yeah.
Like, oh, there are these women who are pirates.
Yeah.
Oh, you could be a pirate for a little while.
Or a volcano, for that matter.
Yeah. You could be an inanimate thing. I just feel like that's the malleability of language, that it leads to all this possibility and tremendous permission. So.
I have another question for each of you, unless there's
Oh,
someone
no,
else
we're-
who wants to jump in.
Kara is saying,
Cara is
Oh,
saying,
wrap it
boy,
up,
have we
okay.
run over time.
Okay. Well, thank you.
thank
I
you
hope
all.
you'll ask. Thank you, Cara. Thank you.
Sorry to cut you off. You're doing great. Thank you all so kindly for joining us. I so appreciate you.
Thank
We
you.
have copies of both Barbara and we have copies of both Barbara and Elizabeth's books at the front. You can find them there. I think they'd be happy to sign them for you. And thank you to our online audience for joining us. And if you have any questions, ask me. If not, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you,
Thank
Carl.
you. Sorry